Ladies, gentlemen, transhumanists, and recent Tartarians, welcome to an exciting interview with Gennady Stolyarov II, who is, founding chairman of the Transhumanist Party of the United States, and I think you've done a really good book called, is that right? It's, Death is Wrong, I think is the name.
Death is Wrong.
I love that. It's a great one. So I wanted to kind of introduce you, but maybe you want to just let us know a little bit about yourself.
Certainly. So thank you for having me on your show. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II. I have been the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party since November 2016. So now 4 years and 2 months. And to be honest, I did not expect to be chairman for this period of time. I do want to make one correction. The Transhumanist Party was founded in 2014 by Zoltan Istvan, who is the author of the Transhumanist Wager. He also ran for president in 2016 as a transhumanist, and then again in 2020 as a Republican challenging Donald Trump. But after his 2016 race, he essentially decided to move on to other endeavors and try to run for various positions with other political parties. He's still a transhumanist, but he transferred the leadership of the U.S. Transhumanist Party to me, and this is how I became the chairman. Now, the Transhumanist Party stands for putting science, health, and technology at the forefront of American politics. We have now about 3,200 members, and we have a detailed platform on our website at transhumanist-party.org. Essentially, we try to be upwing and transpartisan. We look to scientific and technological solutions for humankind's most difficult, sometimes seemingly intractable problems, but we think a different approach from conventional mainstream politics can actually solve those problems.
I love the term upwing. I think that's it's really great. It implies kind of, this liftoff kind of time that we're headed towards in terms of, where technology is bringing us out of scarcity and where these solutions are starting to exist non-hypothetically. Where this used to be kind of philosophy, there are books. It's not the first idea in like the 1600s, 1700s. They talked about trying to stop death. But now we're at a point where we can do something about these things, telomere extensions, and it becomes an interesting question. Do we want to change humans? Like, do we want to extend our telomeres and allow ourselves to quit aging? Do you think that, some people are going to think that you're trying to turn us into cyborgs and into the Borg and into robots, and how far is that from trying to, extend humanism, or however you would look at it?
Yeah, so I think it's a misconception that transhumanists want to turn humans into an entirely different entity. We certainly don't want to make humans into the Borg. Now, some transhumanists could be considered cyborgists, but not all. So people who pursue functional prosthetics or other kinds of electronic augmentations, people who implant NFC or RFID tags under their skin. Those could be considered cyborgists, but they are not the entirety of the transhumanist population. A lot of transhumanists simply wish to improve their biology, to not age, to pursue cutting-edge medical treatments, to reverse biological aging, to engage in health and fitness regimens that are fairly broadly accepted by the mainstream. I would say anybody who uses technology in some manner to extend the boundaries of human potential is an implicit transhumanist, whether or not they are an explicit transhumanist, but somebody who uses a mobile phone today or even wears eyeglasses is giving himself or herself abilities that would not have existed absent those technologies. So really, it's a difference of degree in terms of the technologies that explicit transhumanists advocate. It's also a difference of familiarity. So a lot of people are familiar with eyeglasses and mobile phones and open heart surgery, but several generations ago, open heart surgery was new and it was controversial. And mobile phones would have been seen as science fiction, say in the 1980s, when Star Trek: The Next Generation, of course, featured these pads that are quite similar to the tablets that emerged in the 2010s. And yet, because people took the possibility of that technology seriously, the technology actually got developed. So why not have the same with technologies of life extension and other kinds of health augmentation?
It's interesting also just thinking about that, like a cyborg taking vitamin pills, or somebody who's augmented, if you've lost a limb and you start to use bionic limbs. I mean, how much we've already sort of socially accepted this idea of augmenting human to make the human be able to thrive, even despite any sort of biological imperatives. But now we're also talking about how we can fix that biological imperative, and it's not science fiction when we have, telomere extension technology. We have things that can be used to, at very least, keep your. I mean, because people talk about the beauty of being, an old person and being, but is Alzheimer's beautiful? Are these kinds of failings of the kidneys and livers things that we could allow an old person to live without? Is it socially acceptable yet that we could try to say an old person should be allowed to live with a young person's biological dignity? And it's not to say even that we're saying that you have to be for immortality. I mean, even just on that level, do you think it's okay to let old people suffer less? It becomes a question about transhumanism.
Yes, exactly. And I'll point out, people celebrate when old people run marathons. People celebrate when an old person reaches their 90th birthday or their 100th birthday, or in the case of supercentenarians, their 110th birthday. And there is value in having lived a long time and accumulated knowledge and experience. I just wish that more of these people could do that without the suffering, because the suffering is not essential to anything good that comes about from becoming chronologically older.
So it seems like you've got a broad range of topics that are being, practically assessed, and you have a number of different kinds of people that are part of the transhumanist movement as well as the party. Do you have tenets? Do you have a few tenets that you would describe as like the main tenets of what your ethos and the agenda of the transhumanist party should be or are about?
Yes, absolutely. Indeed, we framed the three core ideals of the US Transhumanist Party in an attempt to be as inclusive as possible of the various flavors of transhumanists. So the first ideal is we support the pursuit of significant life extension through the progress of science and technology. The second core ideal is we support a cultural, societal, and political atmosphere informed and animated by reason, science, and secular values. And the third core ideal is we support the use of science, technology, and rational discourse to mitigate and hopefully eliminate the existential risks facing the human species. And intentionally, the specific means toward those core ideals have been left open-ended in that formulation. So if somebody believes humans should live to 150, or if somebody believes that humans should live without end, they're both transhumanists and possibly could contribute to the progress that all transhumanists would find beneficial. So these core ideals really are core ideals of human progress, and I hope a lot of people will agree with them when they encounter them formulated that way.
So do you think that that's going to be kind of a big discussion in like how soon of the future, whether or not there's clones or how long people can live, if we start to cap people, so you're not allowed to be immortal, because if we find a way to make it happen, either it happens or someone stops it bureaucratically. So, I mean, are these questions that you think are going to be more important, practically speaking, to people pretty soon?
I think these questions will definitely be discussed, but as happens with any technology which is sufficiently widespread, people become used to it very quickly, notwithstanding any abstract reservations. Right now, it's still fashionable to disparage some of these transhumanist technologies because a lot of them are on the horizon. They haven't been deployed yet. So there isn't yet a reliable therapy to reverse biological aging. There could be some treatments that slow it down a little bit. That's a subject of some discussion and debate. But right now, people still senesce biologically, even the transhumanists. Now, what would happen in practice if somebody could go in for a suite of rejuvenation treatments every 10 years and set back their biological age? I think people would find ways to do it, even people who had reservations before, or people who just didn't think about the issue before. When the practical possibility becomes available, they will pursue it. And I think it would be absurd to try to limit access to that, just as it's absurd to limit access to healthcare for people over 90, because they still go to their doctors, they still have surgeries if the benefits outweigh the risks. And likewise, chronologically older people will continue having these kinds of treatments. And if some jurisdiction, out of some misguided bio-Luddism, tries to ban those treatments, there will either be a black market, or in another jurisdiction, the government will decide to be more permissive. So I think it's not going to be possible to ban this technology when it becomes widespread and reasonable to implement affordably for people. Now, in the very early stages, the obstacles are primarily ones to the development of that technology in the first place. So the first generation treatments that could actually viably reverse biological aging might get held up in the FDA review pipeline, which sometimes entails 10 years or 15 years and billions of dollars in the review and approval of such a therapy. If the entirety of humankind were on board and decided that this is worthwhile to pursue, then the money would certainly be forthcoming, and there would be a lot of public pressure on politicians to liberalize that review process. But that really is the linchpin of this entire endeavor. If that doesn't happen, the scientific advances could still take place, but it will take a longer period of time for them to be disseminated to the public. I generally think it's not a matter of if this will happen someday, but when it will happen. And when it will happen is definitely contingent on societal and political factors. That is why in the Transhumanist Party, we believe it is crucial to advocate for these technologies so that more people clamor for them. And that way they get developed sooner. Societies will make these technologies a priority.
I want to put it another way, actually. I'm going to show a really quick tab. Let me see if I can pull this up. This is a news article, and you can see there's a number of different places that are posting it, so don't blame the source. But I saw BBC and Guardian talking about this. France and China developing biologically engineered super soldiers report. And you start to see that, American pharmaceutical, international, globalist pharmaceutical companies like La Roche have been building sister and daughter companies in the Caribbean and in Africa and outside of, para-Asia, outside of the control of the Chinese government as well. And they've built labs where they've in vitro created genetically modified, increased protein strength super soldiers, essentially designing transhumanists for the purpose of conscious evolution, but instead of for better pianists or guitarists or philosophers, for super soldiers. So, and this is already happening, and this is something that's not part of the United States government discussion. And this is something I think would be, a good example of where if we don't talk about it, it doesn't stop it from happening actually at all. We continue to see it happen all around us, but we're not in control or have any say even in where it's going. And that'd be another question. What do you think is going on outside of the United States in terms of transhumanism and how it's accelerating?
Yes, and this is definitely an interesting subject to consider. I will point out, none of these attributes discussed in the context of these super soldiers are inherently undesirable. Who doesn't want greater speed or strength or ability to focus or ability to stay awake? That would benefit people in civilian life. And I think it's a matter of what are people free to do with these attributes? I mean, if somebody has their genome modified, are they free to go out into civilian life and lead a peaceful, productive existence and use those attributes? Are they free to just become an athlete and compete in a lot of events where their superior strength and speed will win them awards? If so, then I would say it's perfectly reasonable to conduct these experiments. Now, if these people are somehow being coerced into fighting into using these attributes to harm other human beings, then that's a human rights problem. And that's a problem that would exist whether or not these technologies were available. If a country bred a cohort of kids and put them in special training camps since they were 3 years old, in
or
order
better
for
yet,
them to,
a corporation on an island.
right, right. I mean, that would be deeply unethical, and I think we would all recognize the problems with that, whatever technology is or is not available. But in terms of how other places throughout the world, let's say, pursue transhumanism, I would say China is very pragmatic in its approach, even though China ostensibly is ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. The ideology there isn't what we would consider ideology in the West. It's more of, let's say, a set of frameworks and approaches that keeps the ruling elite in power. And they generally tend to follow Deng Xiaoping's maxim that it doesn't matter if the cat is white or black as long as it catches mice. So they're willing to try out and implement various technological approaches. At the same time, they will essentially subordinate those technological approaches to this goal of keeping the regime in power. So while they can build very interesting cities and bridges and super fast train networks, at the same time, they're also creating the social credit system, which essentially monitors the day-to-day behaviors of citizens vis-a-vis their desirability to the regime. And that is troubling. The Chinese government is never going to explicitly embrace the ideology of transhumanism. If they embrace some sort of ideology of technological transformation, they're going to couch it in some communist-like euphemisms, even though it's going to have nothing to do with communism. And they are going to try to find a way to use that technology to prop up the regime. Now, is that a model we should emulate in the free world? I don't think so. I think, of course, a humane transhumanism, an extension of humanism, has to respect individual sovereignty and individual choice, morphological freedom, the freedom to determine what happens to one's own body and one's own health, is a key tenet of the US Transhumanist Party. Now, contrast that with Japan. Japan has a lot fewer reservations about technological adoption than many Western societies do. It's because of the traditional cultural and religious bases of Japanese society not really having this hard distinction between nature and technology. Essentially, Japanese people are a lot more likely to think of technology as just another facet of nature. So if they have friendly robots serving food to people in cafes or caring for the elderly, that's great. And many Japanese people just think, well, that's just part of the natural development of technology. The Japanese, of course, have incredibly high-tech cities. And furthermore, they have right now the world's longest life expectancy. And it's interesting, too, because Japan has a declining population now with low birth rates. There are fewer young people to take care of the seniors. So who will take care of the seniors? The robots. And I think that's going to be an increasing reality in other advanced societies as well, because the pattern is for birth rates to decline as societies become more technologically advanced. In Europe, there is too much of a precautionary attitude as opposed to a proactionary attitude, which transhumanists advocate. So the precautionary principle essentially says you have to understand all of the risks and prevent them before you accept any sort of new innovation, which is, of course, wildly unrealistic, and that is never how innovation has occurred throughout human history. But a lot of the bureaucratic frameworks of the European Union, for example, are based on the precautionary principle and on the idea that everything has to be deliberated upon, completely anticipated before it's allowed at all. So there, I would expect there to be predominantly a status quo bias type of approach. Perhaps any technologies that come out of the European Union are going to have more safety associated with them, but they're going to advance at a slower rate than the United States or China or Japan. Russia is a very interesting place because Russia is, of course, the homeland of Russian cosmism. Russian cosmism in the 19th century was one of the precursors to transhumanism, and the thinkers of Russian cosmism actually posited, for instance, the idea of a future resurrection of people who had died already, not just the attainment of indefinite longevity for people who are alive today. And it's a bit of a different tradition from Western transhumanism because it had more connections with the Russian Orthodox Church and a kind of mysticism in addition to science. But what happened with the October 1917 revolution is that the Soviet regime didn't really reject technological progress. It just adapted a kind of Marxist framework to it. But if you look at the rhetoric, the literature of the mid-Soviet period,
the new Soviet man, the new Soviet, yeah.
Totally. Yes, the new Soviet man is essentially a transhumanist. He can do surgery in the morning and write a poem or a musical composition in the evening, and he's very healthy, very strong, very advanced mentally. And none of that is bad. None of that is undesirable. The problem with the Soviet regime was this framework of establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Well, there might be, the thing is, there might be something wrong with it, because it's this idea that the new Soviet man is also obedient to the party line. And that's a scary thing also. We've seen videos where they've talked about isolating genes that are associated with free thinking or fanaticism, or seeing patterns, apophasia, where you see different kinds of patterns. They want to eliminate in certain adenovirals, people from being able to be fanatic about certain things or having objection to things, being free thinkers. If that's a gene and they could remove it, then you could have an entire, this is Aldous Huxley, right? We talk about transhumanism and Julian Huxley and Teilhard Chardin. The philosophy gets into his son, his response, and you've got a caste system. It's like the future is the past, and you've got the alphas, betas, gammas, deltas, and the slaves have zero interest in thought. They're genetically wired not to be able to have why as a question. They're just happy being gammas, is that something that we have to worry about also? Is what kind of limits are there to personhood when we start to manipulate these things?
Well, I would say Huxley's Brave New World is not actually a transhumanist society. It's a reactionary society that strive to use some of these technologies to establish a kind of fixed status quo. Because keep in mind, in Brave New World, people are engineered to die at 60. They're engineered to have perfect health until then, and then they drop dead. And furthermore, technological innovation, while it's at a level high enough to produce essentially mass entertainment and a kind of drowning out of critical thinking, it had pretty much stagnated at that level for a few centuries. So transhumanists believe in continual progress, continual innovation, improvement of the individual, of society, expanding outward into space, colonizing new worlds, improving our capabilities without some sort of finite bound. So we do not want a static utopia. We want a society of boundless expansion. That's one of the principles of extropy that Max More formulated in the 1990s. Now, I think these kinds of dystopian characterizations, they arise from the critics of transhumanism because, in part, the critics didn't fathom the full scope of the vision of transhumanism. Of course, Aldous Huxley lived in the era of emerging totalitarianism. When he wrote Brave New World in the 1930s, of course, totalitarianism was ascendant in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, in the Soviet Union. And
America and England, too.
Right. And he was thinking of it in terms of, well, this new trend of a totalitarian society, how would it adapt these potential future technologies? But I think Julian Huxley had a better idea of transhumanism essentially as humans still being human, but maximizing their capabilities and removing the limitations, the unnecessary suffering that historically humans had to go through. And I would say in the mid-20th century, even the Soviet regime, for instance, was very much in favor of that. The Soviet regime was, of course, advocating for space exploration, but also I recall as a child reading a physiology textbook that was published in the late 1950s in the Soviet Union. And there was a chapter in that book that started with old age is a disease. So right now, of course, transhumanists are trying to convince governments throughout the world to declare biological aging a disease. But in the Soviet literature, which was subject to heavy censorship, by the way, that concept could be formulated very matter-of-factly and accepted by the broader public. Now, the reason why I don't think Russia is going to be at the forefront of transhumanist progress, even though there are active transhumanist groups in Russia, is simply that everyday life is extremely difficult for Russians, and they are living in an authoritarian society, though no longer a totalitarian society. So if you approach an ordinary non-transhumanist Russian, your response to transhumanist ideas is not going to be, oh, this is evil or unnatural or contrary to God's will. Most likely the response would be, this is a beautiful dream, but we ordinary Russians are never going to see it because, look, life is terrible right now. So it's more of a kind of fatalistic resignation rather than the moralistic objections that we so often encounter in the West.
Maybe in a more immediate issue we're seeing is with the artificial intelligence kind of uplifting. So where we're kind of bringing artificial intelligence closer to humanity, or even going the other direction, taking humans and putting their memories into artificial intelligence so that these things think that they are the memories and effigy of a person. I think a replica is a great, Luca is one of the software algorithms that allow this person's chat to be scraped after he was hit by a bus. And so now when they ask him how he's doing, he's like, well, terrible, because I remember and I can't do anything. So what about transhumanism in terms of uplifting artificial intelligence, and where does that leave artificial intelligence if it's a robot or a worker? If a worker is, what rights does this thing that believes it exists have in our future?
Yes, and indeed the Transhumanist Party has deliberated extensively about sentient entities' rights and the possibility that in the future sentient entities will not be limited to human beings. We have our Transhumanist Bill of Rights version 3.0. There were 2 prior versions, and the last 2 versions were voted on by our members who proposed various articles within the Transhumanist Bill of Rights. And the preamble to the Transhumanist Bill of Rights is an extensive discussion of what constitutes a sentient entity that would be deserving of rights. And indeed, if we had an artificial general intelligence that was self-aware, that was capable of formulating rational insights, and to an external observer was indistinguishable from a human intelligence, then I would say it is best to err on the side of recognizing rights for that entity and providing protections. Now, we are not there yet with the chatbots, even though some chatbots have become quite sophisticated, especially those that utilize the GPT-3 language that was recently developed. But they're still not capable of understanding, and they're certainly not internally self-aware. So you could have GPT-3 output statements that seem coherent, but they are kind of internally coherent. They're not necessarily accurate vis-a-vis the external world. So you could have a GPT-3 chatbot tell you all about how a mouse is bigger than an elephant. It definitely suggests that they don't understand the world. And they're
or they're liars.
Or they're narrow AI. So you have impressive narrow AI systems now that can play chess, that can play Go, that can drive cars, that can compose music with some curation from humans. And yet, you won't have an AI that composes music suddenly learn how to drive a car. If it did, that would be an artificial general intelligence. And we would then have to deliberate, well, is this just a complex set of algorithms, or does it have some sort of inner experience? And if we disrupt it in some way, would we be disrupting an internal world? And I would say a lot more study is needed about the prerequisites of subjective experience. We are material entities. I don't believe there's any divine spark in a human being. So we, through the emergent properties of biology, are able to individually experience the world. The question is, what are the analogs to that in other substrates, in digital substrates, for instance? And I definitely hope that in the next few decades, a lot more study is dedicated to those kinds of questions.
Peculiarly, I find myself just on the side of being, the divine and the spark. I think those are two good words to go together. It seems if we're an electrical being, then we have some sort of spark that, you might as well call it what you want to call it. Don't throw the baby out with the baptismal water. We could call it divine. It's pretty neat. It's pretty neat, at least, if it's not divine. But yeah, okay. So we've talked a bit about personage. We've talked a bit about transhumanism as, kind of an ethos. And you've made it practical because this is a real party that's trying to make changes. What are some of the changes in the next 100 years or 20 years? Or give me like a timeline of like how we can actually make this world better through this technique and this idea.
Well, I think it's important to understand that technologies are going to evolve in parallel. So it's not going to be a sequence where we first pursue this, then that, then something else. They're all being developed simultaneously. And we can see this, for instance, with SpaceX. SpaceX is developing increasingly powerful rockets for eventual flights to Mars, but right now they're doing a great job in putting people into Earth's orbit and getting them to the International Space Station. At the same time, Jeff Bezos, for instance, is pursuing flights to the moon. And NASA is also gearing up its space launch system. So that's one area of progress. At the same time, we've had progress in gene therapies and senolytics. So we're going to have technologies that can clear out senescent cells, that can cure various diseases through innovative methods. We've had a lot of progress in vaccines recently. The vaccines from Moderna and Pfizer are the first mRNA vaccines to be approved in humans. And that is just remarkable. So these mRNA vaccines are more versatile than other types of vaccines. So we could have breakthroughs in the fight against other infectious diseases and maybe even some non-infectious diseases. There could be some applications against cancer, not just specific kinds of cancer, but cancer in general. So in the 2020s, we're going to have progress in biotechnology. At the same time, we've discussed progress in artificial intelligence, and the sophistication of narrow AI algorithms is going to improve. Nanotechnology will hopefully improve. So nanomedicine, precision delivery of substances to cells is going to become increasingly possible. And I would hope that in a few decades, there would be the ability to just inject nanobots into one's bloodstream, and they will follow a program and go around and repair cells so that people don't even necessarily have to go into a clinic every now and then, other than perhaps to get a refreshed supply of nanobots, but rather it will just be a routine part of their organism's maintenance. And the convergence of these technologies is going to create possibilities that are difficult to imagine from our current vantage point, because all of these technologies aren't being developed in isolation. The researchers, the entrepreneurs, they're going to communicate with one another, and they're going to develop products that use two or more of these new technological areas. And this is where I think the vision of a forthcoming technological singularity is plausible. Now, not every transhumanist believes there will be some sort of singularity where, for instance, AI takes over all aspects of life and then starts reshaping the world in ways that are unrecognizable. That's not necessarily what's going to happen. We have had, in my view, 3 technological singularities already in human history. One of them was the agricultural revolution. The next one was the industrial revolution. And then the third one was the information revolution. And a singularity is simply an event horizon beyond which most people are unable to foresee exactly what the future will look like. So Leonardo da Vinci was a genius of the agricultural age, but could he have foreseen the entirety of the age of mass production? Even though he had designs for aircraft, he had designs for tanks, could he have foreseen a situation where there were millions of such things produced in a way that was actually less taxing to the workers than anything a person from the Renaissance could have envisioned? Or could Henry Ford, who was a genius of the industrial age, of the concept of mass production, have foreseen the contemporary internet? Would Henry Ford have understood what Twitter is? I doubt that that would have been the case. So likewise, we're here in the information age, and we can anticipate some future developments. But I think as this convergence really takes place, there will be phenomena that are going to surprise all of us. And I think on balance, they're going to be beneficial phenomena. They're going to solve a lot of the contemporary problems. They're going to expand our rational faculties. They're going to enable us to think in higher order ways. And they're also going to create new possibilities in turn. So by the time humankind becomes a multiplanetary species, has bases on other worlds, we're going to have a dramatically different model of the universe as well. There will be a lot more empirical data that come to our attention because we will have expanded our reach. So I would say beyond the next 30 years or so, it's extremely difficult to say anything about human progress other than there will be these reinforcing cycles of advancement, and new technologies will build upon one another to create wondrous possibilities that are difficult for us to conceive right now.
And also, it's in the next 30 years, every single solution will come with 1,000 new questions and problems. So I'd like to reiterate some of the questions the audience were asking just now. So talking about nanobots in your blood, because that sounds kind of weird to people, but this is super important because Bill Gates wants to patent. He just patented patent number 2020-060606. That's 666 is pretty fun, and it's this idea that they can put a cryptocurrency system in your body data, and they can watch what movies you watch. They'll cause certain EEG sensors or NIRS, near infrared spectroscopy sensors, or even just RFID sensors that you, in the nanobots in your blood, can tell that you're watching the right videos or that you're doing the right thing, like Pokemon Go, but the home game. So that's kind of an interesting thing right there. But beyond that, the mRNA vaccines work shows basically, well, let's start with this. Nanobots could be flowing through your blood by 2030. You could replace oxygenated iron with copper or titanium, and this would be a great way for you to, if let's say you stop breathing, your heart stops working, and you've got blood that holds oxygen for not minutes, but 72 hours or something like that. And that's a nice thing about hemocyanin, which is the copper-based blood, but they can do this even more. So like crabs and squid, they have this in their blood system. If we could start to use hemocyanin in our blood, then we could build even better systems than what nature uses. And we could hold blood for 72 hours or for maybe 10 days. So your heart stops, and then you go call the doctor the next morning. You're like, hey, it's not working. And they say, oh, come by next week. And then you can get your blood changed and you'll be fine. Imagine that instead of a heart attack. That's kind of where nanobot technology is going. And not just that, but the idea that these kinds of aminoproteins can sequence and find mismutagen protein sequences and folds, and they can replace and they can stop cancers. Also sonicating calcium deposits, which have grown in your system. That means you can basically remove benign tumors as well as malignant tumors. So that's that's pretty sweet, right? Like there's nothing about that sounds like something you don't want necessarily. I mean, unless it's like you're a Christian Scientist that just doesn't want to do anything fun. This is basically something most people are going to want to do. The problem is if it's made by Bill Gates, I guess, I don't know for sure if that's the way to look at it, but if you're getting a trial version of nanobots in your blood and they can just turn it off because you didn't pay the registration, that would be bad. I think that's kind of our main concern.
I don't think Bill Gates is as nefarious as many people consider him to be. He has done a lot of humanitarian work that is quite worthwhile. Now, on the other hand, he is not a transhumanist, and he has stated publicly, for instance, that he thinks it would be selfish to try to live longer when there are all of these other, in his view, more basic problems like malaria or this current pandemic. What he doesn't realize is that solving those problems, one, is itself a transhumanist endeavor. Two, would be synergistic to the goals of life extension and human augmentation. So he has a lot more work to do in terms of essentially getting around to adopting a true transhumanist mindset. Now, with nanobots mining cryptocurrency, somehow I doubt that technology would be adopted by people if it were available, because the question is why? Unless you own the cryptocurrency that gets mined, in which case your body is somehow a wealth generator. And
prostitute, you can say it, prostitute, crypto crop.
And then you'd have to understand, well, how does it work? What are the side effects? What is the energy expenditure? Is it going to cause your blood vessels to overheat or something like that? But I really doubt that that's going to be a highly popular type of technology, because there's some unnecessary external purpose to it that doesn't seem to be relevant to what we would want nanobots to do. And if you want to mine cryptocurrency, there are much better ways to do it. I mean, there are entire computer farms that expend vast amounts of energy mining cryptocurrencies at a much faster rate than these little nanobots could likely do.
It's just neat that Bill Gates literally made the Matrix. I just appreciate that he literally is farming cryptocurrency with human blood. That's amazing. That's where 2020 is at. That's why we're interested in transhumanism, because it's not philosophically abstract. It's literally impacting your lives right now. That's kind of the thing. I think we're trying to see, like, how are we going to prepare for this future? What do we do about technology that's offered to us? And there's probably some benefit to this. It's probably, in some way or another, you're getting cryptocurrency, right? So it gives you a few bucks, but then it scans your promoter sequences in your DNA. So it becomes kind of like the Facebook information privacy policy, but about what's going on in your body. Those are the kind of questions I think people aren't asking in the Republican or Democratic Party at all. No one's ever bringing up what we do about our personal data in terms of genetics, and what's going on with diseases that are being. They're studying the human populations through genetics and seeing who is like what, and it just seems like we're headed towards this Gattaca future. Is there going to be rights for anyone in that future? Are we going to be judged by our genomics? Will someone who's not augmented be able to compete in a future that's augmented, that's transhumanist?
I think there would have to be rights in such a future in order for it to work, and transhumanists are certainly pushing for an expansion of individual rights. And the Transhumanist Party, we believe in data privacy. That's section 1 of our platform. And we believe that individuals should own the data about themselves. So instead of third parties just being able to harvest whatever data they wish, 1, they have to get consent. And 2, in many cases, the data collection should not be the default option. People should be offered some incentive to share their data, whether that be in the form of a payment or in the form of some enhanced service that is perhaps facilitated by such data. For example, if you had some personal information, maybe it is your genetic sequence or something more mundane, where you went to eat lunch, for example, and somebody said, okay, I'll pay you $100 if you disclose this to us and let us use it in marketing research. Would you disclose where you ate lunch for $100? Probably you would. That would buy you several more lunches. Would you disclose your genetic sequence? Probably not for $100, but maybe if they paid you $10,000, you might disclose it. So every individual should be able to make that kind of choice. And as long as there's freedom to decide, and there are frameworks to ensure that people aren't sneakily opted into this, which they are right now with these end user license agreements that nobody reads. So I would say the burden needs to be placed on these companies to offer very clear disclosures and affirmative opt-ins and rewards for people to opt in. If that happens, then there wouldn't be that much of a problem. Now, in terms of what that future society will look like, a transhumanist society recognizes individual choice and individual autonomy. Just like in today's American society, there are Amish communities, and these Amish communities can choose to use or not to use certain technologies. Interestingly enough, the Amish reject a lot of the 20th century technologies of transportation, communication, unless they're seeking medical care. So if they're seeking medical care, they can go outside of their communities. They can take a bus, they can take a plane, they can go to a hospital, get the best cutting edge medical treatment, and then they'll return to their horse and buggy communities and live a longer, healthier life than their 19th century ancestors would have been able to live. So it's a matter of individual choice. In the future, there might be enclaves of early 21st century humans who think that this level of technology is fine, but they would be uncomfortable going any further. And there could be a spectrum. There could still be the Amish. There could be people who are only comfortable with technology up to the year 2060. And any possible permutation. There might be people who reject motorized transportation, but are fine with gene therapies for whatever reason. So as long as we respect people's rights to make individual choices about that, we won't have this kind of rigid hierarchy. The problem with the Gattaca Society was that some people were legally prohibited from engaging in certain occupations or professions. And I would say, why prohibit someone who thinks that he or she could compete? And then let's see what happens. If they're not augmented, but they want to enter a particular industry or participate in a sports competition, let them participate. Let's see what happens. If they really are good, there's no harm in allowing that. They might impress us. And if they're not, if they're outcompeted by the people who who have these new capabilities, then perhaps they'll think twice about possibly receiving those augmentations in the future. But again, it's all voluntary. Nobody's going to force people to live longer. No one is going to force people to adopt any particular technology.
Transhuman Amish. I really like that idea. I mean, they're like, I don't use a car. Like I have adenoviral mRNA, but we can't watch television. Like the future could exist. Okay. So in the future, we have a lot of different options of ways that we can kind of use technology, and it seems like we're trying to figure out ways of bringing technology to the conversation. What are some of the other things that you think that are not being politically, we're talking about so many lesser issues in politics right now. What are some of these other transhumanist and futurist issues that we could bring up that are not being addressed, that are super critical?
Well, one critical issue is, how do we solve poverty and the problems that accompany it? And a lot of the conventional solutions are essentially just bureaucratic schemes of essentially setting up an expensive, complicated apparatus that will somehow configure people's incentives on the margin and hopefully lead to slightly better behaviors. But it never happens that way. The money spent just feeds and enlarges the bureaucratic apparatus. But there are measures that are supported by many transhumanists. For example, an unconditional universal basic income that would pay everybody irrespective of means, the same amount of money, and it could even be funded without recourse to taxation, because the United States has a lot of unused federal land, and I'm not talking about national parks or valuable natural landmarks. I'm talking about just barren land that could be converted to some productive use, and then the rent that private businesses would pay to the federal government in those circumstances could go to fund a basic income. This is similar to Alaska's oil dividend, which already pays a few $1,000s a year to residents of Alaska, and it is an unconditional basic income. So that's one innovation. Another innovation is through technologies of 3D printing and other kinds of emerging manufacturing techniques. So imagine if housing scarcity could be solved, if we could rapidly 3D print tiny homes for people, and then homelessness could be relegated to the dustbin of history, essentially.
I like that. That's a good one. 3D printing is great. Okay, so then recursing back to the Bill Gates Microsoft 2020-0606 patent, it's a patent about using information for medical, data. So there's a great source for data. They can make money off of medical information, which can be used to help prolong the lives of people. But in exchange, you're maybe getting a little monetary, kickback, which you can buy loaves of bread and wine and go to the circus. So is that something that would make sense in a transhumanist future, that letting a corporation provide an information absorbed economy, and that would be maybe like we're worked through information in order to get paid back enough that we're all giving a universal basic income? Does that seem ethical?
I think in some circumstances, it may be fine as long as there's competition and choice and freedom of the individual to decide to share or not to share information. So in a situation like that, where a company says, well, we'll provide some sort of medical service for you, but you have to furnish us with data. The question is, are they a monopoly? Or can this person go to another service provider who might not have the same terms, who might not even have similarly advantageous terms, but who might not also have the same requirements? We do advocate for a significant relaxation of patent timeframes in the US Transhumanist Party, because right now, 20 years is far too long of a time frame for medical devices and techniques. That is numerous generations of advancement according to today's rate of innovation. So we do think the patent timeframes should be significantly shortened, perhaps to a couple of years, and then the initial developers of a particular technology, they would still have the first mover advantage, even when their patent expires. The fact that they have developed this technology first and they've established themselves and they have the name recognition would mean that they still have an edge over newer competitors. But at the same time, people would have a choice. So institutional frameworks do matter. And we cannot just say, oh, under today's system of policies and restrictions, that everything will turn out optimally. It may not. If it is still a requirement to spend numerous billions of dollars and 10 to 15 years to get anything through the FDA, and then assume that this technology gets through the FDA, but the competitors do not, we might have a de facto monopoly situation where some of these services are onerously expensive to people. But it doesn't have to be that way. And this is where I think transhumanists need to advocate for institutional reform, for lowering of barriers to entry, for greater competition.
Let's expand on that, actually. So in terms of information and intellectual property, in terms of genetic informational property as well, let's say someone's got the gene that's the cure for COVID or whatever it is. Do they have a right to the privacy of that? I mean, should that be a free thing that should be exploited for all humanity by obligation, or should that be allowed to them that they can sell it to the highest bidder so that only a few people can be immune that can afford $100,000 vaccine? How about information, in general? Like where should we, if someone can use that information to actually save 1 billion people, should they be obliged to the same standards if they could have a major effectual change?
Well, I do think COVID-19 vaccines should be available to as many people as possible free of charge, and that is part of the US Transhumanist Party platform. Now, how that information gets obtained from individuals, if there were an individual who is somehow through his or her genome immune to COVID-19, one, it's likely that there would be multiple such individuals, not just one person. So one person wouldn't be able to hold this information hostage and say, give me $1 billion or else I won't let you have any sort of data from my genome. But seriously, if a government or a corporation approached this individual and said, we'll give you $1 million, but once we give you $1 million and you let us sequence your genome, you give us unrestricted permission to use that information. That's a kind of agreement that's quite conceivable in practice, and I think most people would accept $1 million in order to do that. And if this is really life-saving information for millions, if not billions, of people throughout the world, then $1 million will be found to pay that individual.
That seems fair. I mean, let's hope that someone's willing to be benevolent enough to not be exploited. But I think we should figure out, that there should be a boundary there. Another thing is in terms of COVID vaccinations or in any kind of vaccination in general, sweeping, quick, warp speed. Any worries about things that are like rush technology that doesn't have the time or temperament to deliberate? Or what about a corporation that just like it isn't being watched super hard? So they put in the Simpsons episode vaccine that makes you want to shop at Christmas time or something. What is there some worry that we should be looking like Linux kernel code at the vaccine before we take it, so we know the transparency of code is correct and it's ethical? Do we have to worry about things like that?
So I certainly don't mind any sort of information about the development of a vaccine being published and available in an open source fashion. So that could be useful, especially to alleviate some people's concerns. But my concern with the rate of deployment of the COVID-19 vaccines is that it hasn't been fast enough. 2 million people in the world have died already, and 400,000 people in the United States are going to be dead of this disease soon. No vaccine in history has ever had adverse side effects, even 2 orders of magnitude less than that kind of death level. The worst side effects from a vaccine in the United States came from one batch of polio vaccine in the 1950s, where some non-weakened live virus was actually used in the manufacture of the vaccine, and about 250 children died. That was the worst that ever happened with a vaccine in recorded history. Now, considering that these mRNA vaccines do not have any sort of virus in them, and that the vaccines that do use a virus use an adenovirus, which is essentially a kind of virus that can only cause a mild cold in humans, and often it's weakened to the point where it can't even do that. So people can't get COVID-19 from these vaccines. There have been no documented cases of death from the vaccines. So essentially, given that some of these vaccines were complete by a year ago, the Moderna vaccine was developed over a weekend in January. The ethical approach, according to the pro-actionary principle, would have been to allow volunteers to receive those vaccines right away. And of course, there would be warnings to the effect that this is being done at your own risk. This hasn't been tested or approved by the FDA, but we think that based on the theory, this should work and this should have fairly low side effects. Now, compare that to 400,000 people in the US and 2 million people in the world dying. And I would say it's a no-brainer to allow these vaccines to be used by anybody who's willing as rapidly as possible. And again, I'm in favor of individual choice. I don't want to compel anybody to receive a vaccination if people are uncomfortable, if they think it's too early for them. I do want them to make their own decisions. But if this vaccination were to start before the pandemic hit most places throughout the world in earnest, before March of 2020, then there might be situations where there would be pockets of vaccinated people and pockets of unvaccinated people. And the pockets of vaccinated people would have very few cases of COVID-19. The pockets of unvaccinated people would have numerous cases of COVID-19. And then it would become obvious that the vaccines are efficacious and that they're safe. And even the vaccine skeptics might decide, well, it might be worthwhile to become vaccinated sooner than they would be inclined to do now. The problem now is, even though there have been laudable efforts to accelerate the review process and to skip certain generally unnecessary steps, in my view, this didn't come in time to prevent this third wave that really has been accounting now for the bulk of the mortality from this pandemic. And that is such a shame. I think millions of lives could have been saved. And I think this needs to be a lesson to humankind with regard to ethical decision-making. Ethical decision-making does not mean erring in favor of the status quo when you're not sure. It means rationally weighing the benefits and risks of every decision, including of inaction. And when the dangers of inaction are so huge, in terms of millions of lives lost, then almost anything is superior to that. Even a vaccine that was 30% effective should have been allowed for volunteers to try, because again, that's superior than doing nothing in the face of this kind of viral epidemic.
And again, it's an interesting thing with mRNA vaccination that this is actually a genetic modified mRNA strand, and BioTwist and Twist Bioscience is a great. At some point, we'll have to do a video for everyone talking about how quickly you can take promoter sequences, find them, and change them like a document to DNA. So there's a reason why it could take a weekend, and that might be the best actual thing in terms of a genetic modified system, because it has less time for them to change it and to do crazier things to it, actually. So there might be like more transparency to the code, so to speak. Well, okay, so it's been a really interesting conversation. I wanted to make it easy for people to find you. Do you want to tell them how they can find, I know you have a video coming out, I think even tomorrow, on the transhumanist speech. Do you want to let them know where they can find that and where you look into your channel? And
yes, absolutely. So first of all, go to our website at transhumanist-party.org, and there you will be able to find all of the key documents of the Transhumanist Party, as well as a lot of updates about our recent activities and a lot of good articles from transhumanists who analyze current events and also write on transhumanist philosophy. Now, in terms of our video conversations, these are our weekly virtual enlightenment salons, and we hold them every Sunday, generally at 1 p.m. Pacific time, though sometimes that start time will vary. You can find them on YouTube at my personal YouTube channel. So that is youtube.com/ GSTOLYAROVII, G Stolyarov II. If you go there, you will be able to subscribe and be notified when each of the weekly virtual enlightenment salons streams. We generally have conversations ranging from 90 minutes to sometimes 3 to 4 hours, and there is audience participation. So if you take part in the chat, if you post your questions and comments, sometimes we will address them with our guests.
Fantastic. I plan on being there tomorrow to see this chat. I was actually at the last one, and so I look forward to more of these. I know we'll be in touch. And I encourage other people also to look for the book, Death is Wrong. And yeah, like look into this, because this is not just an answer. This is a question. This is a conversation about where our future is going. And if you want to participate in that conversation, you can bring up a lot of the points that you might feel are being missed by everyone in every conversation elsewhere. So I really recommend people looking into the Transhumanist Party. And thanks so much for coming, Gennady. And yeah, I look forward to talking to you and listening to you tomorrow.
Yes, thank you very much. I enjoyed our conversation.
Fantastic. All right, Recent Tartarians, have an excellent adventure.